Excelentísimo Señor Embaixador Gaspar Fernández Neto, excelentíssimos senhores embaixadores, as minhas senhoras e os meus senhores, é para mim prazer e privilégio hoje enviar uma mensagem a esta conferência e, através da conferência a Angola, ao presidente José Eduardo dos Santos, ao ministro de Relações Exteriores Jorge Chicote e a todo o povo angolano. Nesse dia tão importante na história de Angola, o 40º aniversário da sua independência. Excelências, ladies and gentlemen, it's both a privilege and a pleasure for me to be able to send a message to this conference today. I only regret that I am unable to be with you personally on account of illness. This is a message not only to the conference, but to Angola, to the President, His Excellency José Eduardo dos Santos, to the Foreign Minister, His Excellency Jorge Chicote, and also to the whole people of Angola, for whom I continue to have such cherished memories. I first became interested in Angola a long time before I ever went there. This was in the 1960s. My UN career had started in Asia and for some years in Latin America, but then I went to Africa. I was stationed as head of the UN program in Ethiopia in the 1960s. And there I met another great friend of Angola, now alas no longer with us, the man who first drew the attention of the general public to African history, Basil Davidson. Basil Davidson was the one person who kept the horror of the Angolan conflict in the face of public attention, and who himself went and worked there during those terrible years. So that was, I did not know then that 30 years later I was myself going to find myself there trying to deal with the conflict. Unlike other African countries, where usually the people fighting for independence stuck together until they reached power and then the difficulties began, in Angola there was already division within the country in the nationalist forces even before independence. So there would have been conflict, but it would not have been as dreadful as it became had it not been that these two superpowers were arming the two sides, one arming the MPLA, the other UNITA. And although they were not major arms, they were enough to kill an awful lot of people. But then when the Berlin Wall came down, they lost interest. So therefore, they were the victims of the Cold War. It always seemed to me that this was a mistaken strategy, because afterwards Angola was still as important in terms of what was happening in Southern Africa, not so much in terms of the Cold War, but in terms of the economic importance and the key role that Angola could play in the economic and political stability of that very important part of the world. The key lessons of the elections of 1992 are many, and I'm sure that other people here in this conference who were also with me at that time example, Ambassador John Flynn and Ambassador Antonio Monteiro will have other views also to add to my own. I would like to say that the first thing we should remember is that in a mission that was considered not to have been successful, the elections were extremely successful. It was a very moving occasion when people walked for days through the bush, stood all night sometimes, because it was 2 days long, in order to cast their votes. Although the operation was successful, the patient died because immediately afterwards Angola was back at war when Savimbi withdrew his generals from the army the joint army we had just sworn in, and went back to war. Now, why did that happen? And that is one of the basic problems with UNAVEM 2. We had a much too restricted a mandate, not even the resources to carry out that mandate successfully. We were only an observer mission, and it was the two sides which had to monitor one another. We had no armed forces. We only had 350 unarmed military observers and some police observers, of course a lot of civilians as well, but no way of enforcing the demobilization, which we could only observe and report on. A related problem was that the date of the elections had been graven in stone. It had to take place this was arranged at Bessès without the participation of the UN, and it was fixed then that the date would be between September and November in 1992. There was no provision of conditionality, that is to say, to be sure that the basis for carrying the elections through peacefully had not been established, the process of demobilization, which we were not in charge of. We simply had to verify it. Another problem was that the sides insisted on taking a winner-takes-all position. I tried very hard with all of them to persuade them that we should perhaps just take 2 steps at this and try to begin with a government of national reconciliation and unity, because this was, we must remember, a country which was not only coming out of conflict, as we hoped, but was also trying to transform itself from a centrally controlled economy to a market economy. And there was no private sector at that time in the country, so that whoever lost, just the prize was the state. Again, in the UN and the international community generally, there was a misapprehension that elections were the end-all of a peace process. The resolution of the Security Council, which established the mission of UNAVEM 2, it ended simply saying that the elections would take place, we would see that the new government was established and then would leave. And as was shown then and several occasions afterwards, elections can so often be the beginning, not the end of a problem or the solution, but rather the beginning of a whole series of new problems. This was the reason why, in the end, I decided to leave, that I could no longer go on. A mediator must feel that they have some leverage, something, either a carrot or a stick, or perhaps a bit of both, in order to be, but I was left absolutely powerless. And I was devastated. The international community was not ready to come in and with enough resources to try and impose the results of the election. And that was again a failure of the international community. Now, these lessons were learnt. They were learnt, I think, in South Africa. They were also learnt in Mozambique. And the Secretary General had informed me that he wished me to move from Angola to Mozambique. And I had indicated that I was not ready to go unless the mission was given sufficient authority, sufficient military support, and an element of conditionality which would enable the head of the mission to fix the date of the elections at a time when it was felt that the conditions were sufficiently settled, especially the demobilization. When I went back in 2014, just last year, I found an enormously changed panorama in Angola, especially in Luanda. I saw that in Luanda there were pockets of poverty, and that also that Luanda, which had been, I think, only about 1 million inhabitants when I was there, was now absolutely packed with the people who'd taken refuge from the countryside. I found a country also that was very reliant on one particular commodity. I found that the wealth produced by those economies was not actually being distributed, and there were these enormous differences between people who were very rich and people who were living at the poverty level. In my conversations my very frank conversations that I had with President José dos Santos and also with Minister Chicote, I mentioned my concerns about this. And I was very pleased to learn from them that they too were concerned about these elements and convinced of the urgency of doing something about it. I think a lot of what will happen in 40 years' time depends on the actions that are taken now. If those things are done, then I see a period of sustainable peace. If they are not, then I think there is a danger because, you know, the causes of conflict nearly always are based in problems of marginalization, of poverty, of people feeling they have no access either to power or resources. Although we are fortunate in Angola that since 2002 we have had peace, we must not be complacent and think that's going to go on inevitably without other action. Sustainable peace means also not only lack of shooting, but and no guns, or guns not being used, but also the development of all sorts of measures that will make life better for all of Angolans, so that they can feel themselves an integral part of a process of development. If one had to pick out 3 priorities for the government at the present time, I think the first would be measures to improve the distribution of income in the country and the removal of poverty. Angola has no reason to be poor with its present resources. Secondly, the diversification of the economy, because the outlook for oil does not look brilliant at the moment. The problem of the decrease in prices at the present time. And secondly, the question of the amount of reserves that Angola has, how long they will go on, so that Angola has enormously rich agricultural resources, mineral resources. There are all sorts of other sectors that could be developed. The third thing I would like to see happen now is further development of democratic institutions, of democratic education among among the population as a whole, and also a multi-party country where there is also room for a responsible opposition to have their voice heard. We need, I think, more transparency.